thank you so much, Daniel. There's a theologian named N.T. Wright who talks about how Christians stand with one foot in the current world and one foot in the coming world. And prayer is the intersection of where we stand. So friends, whatever you bring into this room, hope or pain or loss, know that it's welcome and that God sees it and is with you. Morning, guys. Morning. Good to see your faces. I like seeing your faces every Sunday morning. I hope that that's true for me. I hope that my face doesn't repulse you in any way. I like looking at you all. Thanks for being here, for joining us. You guys, I have important news to share with you. Every single one of you in this room is a time traveler. Yeah, you may not realize it, but every time you eat at a restaurant or pack into a concert venue or grab a coffee, you have stepped back in time to ancient Athens. Let me explain. This is how Athens is described in Acts 17. All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Does that not sound like our culture? We live in a time where people embrace wildly diverse ideas. We live in a time of open-mindedness where people are by and large incredibly interested in new things so long as they don't demand too much on them. Think about it. Have you noticed how much stuff people believe in today or are open to today? I've got a friend who believes that every person emits a color aura that says something about their personality. Mine's purple, I learned. I have a friend who believes that they were born on a day where all the stars and planets were specially aligned, and so now those stars and planets dictate every part of their lives. Their good moods and their bad moods are written in the stars and beyond their control. Another friend of mine thinks that's silly, but that friend thinks that all human beings ever born are entirely dictated by one of 9 universal Enneagram personality types. I have a friend who believes that beauty will save the world. I have a friend who believes that the only things that exist are the things we can see, smell, taste, touch, and hear. I have a friend who believes that everything that came to exist happened because of a series of unpredictable and random events, but now everything functions perfectly and by defined laws. I have a friend who believes ball is life. I have a friend who believes that the earth is flat and Stanley Kubrick directed the moon landing from a film set and he can prove it because of the shadows in the pictures. Everyone believes in something. Just look around the next time you get your coffee. Odds are you'll see someone reading a self-help book about mind control and 2 other people talking about the power of their chi and a barista who openly identifies as a witch. We live in a time that is spiritual but not religious. A fun fact for you, the fastest growing religious demographic in the US today are nuns. Not N-U-N-S, not the women who pray and wear the habits. N-O-N-E-S. That is, people who are religiously unaffiliated, but in some way still spiritual. And it's largely because in our time, we like to think of ourselves as particularly open and inclusive people who don't get bogged down in things like religion and doctrine and dogma. We're free thinkers when it comes to spirituality. And there's a good instinct in that. There's a lot of damage that's been done in the name of certainty and dogma and religion over the years. I get the resistance. But here's the challenge. Beliefs can't be entirely open-minded in the end. Because to believe one thing inherently means to deny something else. If you're to affirm anything, you have to not believe something different. As an example, if you're in this room and you believe that all human beings have inherent worth, regardless of their ethnic background or their social standing or their gender or their age or their immigration status, that also means you don't believe in the Hindu notion that human beings are born into a particular caste or class, and that in order to achieve salvation, they have to live well within that caste or class. Beliefs, by their very nature, imply choosing to stake your life to one thing and not another thing. Choosing to say that one thing is true and another thing isn't. And by the way, that doesn't mean you have to be a jerk about it. There's a lot of people who are jerks about their beliefs. How we hold our beliefs is just as important, and we'll talk about that later. But holding a belief always at some level means I can't be inclusive of everything. At some level, I have to say, I believe this, and I don't believe this. So what do you believe? Have you actually thought about it? Socrates famously said, the unexamined life is not worth living, and he was right. But we live in a culture where most people lead unexamined lives. Some people are just coasting through their days, running the risk of ending up with a life they didn't really want but never stopped long enough to consider. Others of us are spiritually open, but just unreflective, or we don't know where to start. Others of us are constantly being manipulated by politicians and corporations just to fall in line with beliefs that give those institutions power and control over them. Friends, in our time, the question, what do you believe in, is the most revolutionary one we can ask. And if we learn to do it well, it will utterly transform us and the world around us. We're continuing in a teaching series here at Midtown we're calling Link in the Chain, Participating in God's Mission. And during this series, we've been exploring the remarkable story of God's redemptive and restorative plan realized in Jesus. But we're also looking at the ways that that story leads us to become links in the chain of God's redemption. God's redemptive story only ever comes to us from someone else, and it only ever goes through us on the way to someone else. And so this morning, we get to travel back in time with Paul to ancient Athens. And given the similarities of Athenian culture with our culture, I think we find some important distinctions that we need to have as Christians if we're to engage the world well. And I think if we do it, we'll find ourselves wrapped up in God's transformative work in our own time. So friends, if you have a Bible, I encourage you to open it with me to the book of Acts. We're going to be in Acts chapter 17, starting in verse 16. Acts is the 5th book in your New Testament, if you're flipping there. So early on in your New Testament. If you don't have a Bible, by the way, that's okay. The words are going to be behind me on the screen here, so you can follow along. Also, if you don't have a Bible, let me know. My love language is giving free books to people. I love giving books away, so let me know. I'd love to get you a Bible. Acts 17, starting in verse 16. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogues with the Jews and the devout persons, and also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Also, some Epicurean and Stoic philosophers debated with him. Some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" And others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities." This was because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. And so they took him, and they brought him to the Areopagus and asked him, "May we know this new teaching that it is you're presenting? It sounds rather strange to us, so we'd like to know what it means." Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. And then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you, the God who made the world and everything in it. He who is Lord of heaven and earth does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. And since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." And at that point, Paul left them. But some of them joined him and became believers, including Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Would you pray with me, friends? Father, we come to you in the midst of a culture that loves talking about what's new. Something fresh, a new idea, some self-help read, a new app, a new device. We love new things that can improve our lives, but oftentimes we don't stop enough to reflect on why we feel that need to be improved. Why we constantly feel the need to grow and to change. Why we have in our own lives maybe attuned to an unknown God. Some divine thing that we're searching for and groping for. Sometimes we don't even really know what we believe. And so I pray this morning that your Spirit would illuminate our hearts and our minds. That you would show us what it is we really believe, what it is that we're longing for in our lives. and that you'd connect that to you. That you would show each and every one of us the things that we're longing for are found only and ultimately in relationship with Jesus. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. In Jesus' name, amen. Architecturally beautiful, intellectually stimulating, gloriously historic Athens. When we arrive to the city in Acts 17, it remained the intellectual and cultural hub of the whole Roman Empire. Think like Oxford or Cambridge or Yale or TikTok, right? Athens was the place where everyone was learning and wondering and thinking about what they believe in. This is where some of the greatest minds in Western history walked. Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, those people that got talked about while you were napping in your college lectures. But when Paul gets there, he doesn't wax poetic about high-minded philosophy. He just keeps talking about this guy named Jesus. Over and over and again in Acts, that's what he's been up to. And his work has been making waves all over the ancient world. People's lives are being changed. Miracles are happening. It's been wild. See, that's the thing about following Jesus. Not only does he transform your life, but he makes you into someone who just can't help but talk about his transformation. And then he starts to transform people around you through you. It's crazy. Classic Jesus stuff. But what soon becomes clear in Athens is that these people have absolutely no idea what Paul is talking about. They call him a babbler, which made a couple of you laugh. The word in Greek is actually even funnier. It's literally seed picker. He's like a bird picking up random seeds and putting them together and trying to make a thought. They're like, this guy doesn't make any sense. And others are trying to understand him a little bit more. They're taking him seriously, but they misunderstand him. They think he's talking about two new gods to add to their pantheon. He's talking about Jesus, and he's talking about a god named Resurrection, apparently. And so they're confused, and they invite him to come speak on this topic more, to enlighten them. And so they drag him to the Areopagus, which was the place where all the best thinkers and philosophers of the day would talk and argue and the rest. That's a really intimidating place for Paul to get dragged, even as a well-read Pharisee like he is. This is like defending a doctoral thesis before the best PhDs on a subject. It's not exactly a casual coffee meetup. And so as Paul enters the Areopagus as a Christian, there are certain questions looming over this interaction. Questions like, can the message of Jesus hold up to intellectual scrutiny? Can someone be a thinking person and a person of faith? Or maybe just more practically, how can a Christian talk about the claims of Jesus and invite others to know him in such a diverse place where they might get demeaned or degraded? As it turns out, our questions haven't changed that much. But I think it's important to notice, Paul's method for engaging his neighbors here is quite different from the methods of many Christians today. Notice he doesn't stand with a picket sign on proclaiming God hates Greeks and hoping that they get shamed to following Jesus. He doesn't say, let's build a big church with a charismatic speaker and mediocre coffee and a Christian concert and hope it impresses them. No, Paul's method of engagement with his neighbors is different. It involves listening really well. It involves understanding and speaking to the deepest longings and hopes of the people around him. It involves creativity and love and invitation. And so I want to take some time to look at what Paul is up to here. I want to look at 3 parts of his interaction in Athens, because I think if we learn from these well, we will find ourselves becoming more and more links in the chain of God's redemption in the lives of our neighbors and our culture. Those 3 things that Paul does, we need to learn from him by going where Paul goes, seeing what Paul sees, and doing what Paul does. We need to go where Paul goes, see what Paul sees, and do what Paul does. First, we need to go where Paul goes. At this point in history, there were no Christian churches in Athens. Christians were still a marginalized, persecuted minority in the Roman Empire. And so in verse 17, you'll notice he doesn't start in the church because there are none. Look where he goes. He goes to the marketplace every day with those who happen to be there. That's a crucial detail. The marketplace in Athens was called the Agora. It was a place where all sorts of cultural creation happened. All human activity was centered there. There's a biblical scholar named F.F. Bruce who describes it this way. He says, on or just off the marketplace were temples, law courts, state offices, public archives, libraries, shops, concert halls, dance halls, gymnasiums, theaters, and galleries. Everyone back then was constantly spending their time at or near the Agora. Artists were creating, and judges were deliberating, and politicians were debating, and businesses conducted business, and news was being announced to the public, and your fancy latte at the coffee shop was getting made. Philosophers argued. All of those things were happening there. Which meant the agora is what shaped people's beliefs most deeply about themselves and God and the world. It was the place where people worked and made sense of their lives. That is where Paul spends his time. You guys, Paul is showing us that if we want to become links in the chain of God's redemptive story, we have to go to the marketplace. That is, we have to immerse ourselves in every part of culture, in all of the areas that people are being shaped, and then live as different sorts of people there. Belief in Jesus will always spring us forth into culture. It will never isolate us from it. And that's actually a really radical claim in our time. See, if you pay close attention to how most people think of spirituality in our culture, including Christians, we've been taught to assume that spirituality is just a private thing. I believe something because it brings me inner peace. Or I believe something because it helps me reach my goals, or makes me feel happy, or it punches my ticket to heaven, or whatever else. We live in a culture of selfie spirituality. What I believe is good because of what it does for me in my own little private skull-sized kingdom. And that's why people in our culture say things like, I love that for you. Right? That's so great for you. Because in a time of selfie spirituality, I don't have to consider what your belief means for me or anyone else in the world. You can have that and I can have mine. Oh, it's so great for you. But here's the problem. The claims of Jesus are not and have never been private. They are deeply personal. They speak to the deepest parts of who we are, but they never ever stay there. They're never compartmentalized from the rest of life. See, when Jesus came, he proclaimed that his life, death, and resurrection sparked redemption and restoration for all things, not just some nice, warm, and fuzzy private feelings. That's what he meant by the kingdom of God. That's what we sung about. He meant that God's kingdom was breaking into every corner of creation, every part of life, here and now, and is upsetting the kingdoms of the world that bring death and decay and loss. That's actually the whole point of his life, death, and resurrection, was to initiate this new kingdom and invite people into it because it has arrived now. Where the world's kingdoms say, follow your heart, Christ's kingdom says, lose your life for my sake and find it. Bear your cross, follow me. Where the world's kingdoms and politicians, especially today, say, only love and prioritize those closest to you, Christ's kingdom says, love your enemies and welcome the stranger. Where the world's kingdoms say, seek power and assert your will, Christ's kingdom says, the greatest among you will be your servant. Where the world's kingdoms say, harbor resentment and anger and get back at those who have hurt you, Christ's kingdom says, forgive. For you are in just as much need of forgiveness as anyone else. And where the world's kingdoms say, consume and compile and prioritize your own comfort, Christ's kingdom says, give generously. Sell all you have and give it to the poor. You can't serve God and money. Everything Christ did and said was about upsetting the world's kingdoms and bringing God's life to every nook and cranny of the universe. That's what he's about. And then he looks at every one of us and everyone he interacted with and said, turn to me, give your life to me, and seek that kingdom with me. That is the whole point of following Jesus, is that we become transformed people who participate in his work in every part of culture and life. That's why nowhere in the Bible will you ever find a split between belief and behavior. We often think that in our world, that beliefs are things in my head and behavior is something different. The Bible never splits those up. If you truly believe in Jesus and his kingdom, it will shape how you show up in every part of your life in the world. And if the way you show up isn't changing, it might be that you haven't believed. An authentic faith in Jesus shoots us into every arena in our culture. And guys, the truth is Christians have been really bad at that for the last few decades. Rather than entering into our culture, we often isolate ourselves from it. Rather than living as Christians in schools alongside others where culture is being shaped and formed, we have our own separate Christian schools. Rather than engaging the arts as Christians alongside others in the marketplace, we've created an entire cottage industry for our own art that doesn't make sense or resonate with anyone who's not already a Christian. Rather than engaging the hard questions of the faith or the complicated past of the church or the real spiritual experiences of our neighbors in the marketplace, we make them come to our churches. We live in a world that's made the word Christian into an adjective to describe churchy behaviors or a marketing term for a certain genre of not really that good music or movies. And the result is that multiple generations of American followers of Jesus assume that the church is one part of their life that is irrelevant or indifferent to the rest of their lives. There's a guy named William Deal who wrote a whole book on this. It's called Christianity and Real Life. He put it this way. He said, "In the almost 30 years of my professional career, my church has never once suggested that there be any type of accounting of my on-the-job ministry to others. My church has never once offered to improve those skills which could make me a better minister in what I was already doing. There's never been an inquiry into the types of ethical decisions I must face, or whether I seem to communicate the faith to my coworkers. I've never been in a congregation where there was any type of public affirmation of a ministry in my career. In short, I must conclude that the church doesn't have the least interest whether or how I minister in my daily work." This is why we do this time tomorrow at Midtown, friends. Because oftentimes, rather than talking about the kingdom and its far-reaching power, the church has settled for a selfie spirituality and cut ourselves off from culture. And just a little reflection shows how honestly, profoundly dumb that split is. Think about it. What's more Christ-like? Going to a Bible study or feeding the poor? Or making furniture or painting a sunset? Is the work of a pastor standing in front of people like this any more Christ-like than the work of a soccer coach? Or a business person? Or janitor? Or lawyer? The distinctions we've made are false ones, friends. And the result is tragic. People all over our culture are missing the good news of God's kingdom because we just live in a holy huddle. We've actually prevented our neighbors from knowing and experiencing the love of God and oftentimes appeared to them judgmental or pretentious because we've separated from them. To be Christian at all is to get into the marketplace because, as Teresa of Avila put it, Christ has no body now but yours. No hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks with compassion on the world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes. You are his body. And by the way, this sort of entry into the marketplace, it's not a new thing. It's actually exactly how the early church functioned. The early church did everything they did. They transformed the Roman Empire with no social or political or cultural clout at all by living this way, showing up in the marketplace and being different sorts of people there. We actually have a letter that records what the early church did and describes the early church. It's called the Epistle to Diognetus. Here's what early Christians were described as being like. Christians are distinguished from others neither by country nor language, nor do they, like some, proclaim themselves the advocates of any merely human doctrines. Following the customs of the natives in respect to clothing, food, and the rest of their ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. They marry, as do all others. They beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. It was common in the ancient world. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They're in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. They love all people and are persecuted by all. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of all things and yet abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet in their very dishonor are glorified. They're reviled and blessed. They're insulted and repay the insult with honor. That is Christianity in the marketplace. That is the kingdom of heaven breaking into all the world's false kingdoms. We need to go where Paul goes. So spend time at your local restaurant and concert venue and coffee shop and get to know new people. Ask what books and movies and TV shows they spend their time with and why they love those things. Get invested in your local neighborhood organization to get to know people and actually will get involved in seeking the good of your neighbors. Allow Jesus' love and grace to inform how you show up in your work. Don't just follow the career trajectory accumulation thing that culture tells people. Give of yourself away in your workplace. We need to go where Paul goes. But going there alone isn't enough. We also have to see what Paul sees. It's mentioned in verse 16. He sees that the city was full of idols. All over Athens, there were scattered statues to tons of gods and goddesses that folks believed in and worshipped. Gods were so common in that time that there was a Roman satirist who once claimed it was easier to find a god in Athens than a man. And so if someone felt that sex was the most important part of their life, that the freedom to pursue sex as they saw fit was the most important thing, there was a goddess for them to worship. Her name was Aphrodite, the goddess of sexual love and beauty. If someone felt that money and wealth and accumulation were the most important things in their life, there was a god for them to worship. His name was Pluto, the god of money, also the god of the underworld. Funny that those two things overlapped. If someone felt that getting married or becoming a mom or prioritizing family and kids were the most important thing, there was a goddess for them. Her name was Hera. She was the goddess of marriage and family. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples filled the agora that Paul walked through. And seeing all of these gods brought him to a sobering realization that underneath all of the incredible art of Athens, underneath their philosophy and government and architecture, were idols. Or to put it another way, everyone in his day was worshiping something that shifted their life, that deformed their life. Paul was seeing what each and every one of us should see when we enter into the marketplace. Everyone worships something. And while we may not have physical statues in our own time, if we dig underneath our thoughts and our behaviors and our actions, we'll find the things we worship. Underneath the overworking employee is often worship of career and accomplishment. Underneath the pursuit of marriage or a partner is often worship of the approval of others. Underneath the purchase of another house or another car or getting a bigger bank account is often worship of comfort and security. Under our social problems is disforming worship. Under our governments is disforming worship. Under our anxieties is disforming worship. Everyone believes in something, which means everyone is worshiping something. And it's important to note, the things we worship aren't bad in and of themselves. As an example, Apollos in Greek culture, he was the god of art. Is there anything wrong with art? No. We love art here at Midtown. A big art fan in a variety of ways. Is there anything wrong with worshiping art? Yes. Because when art becomes your entire meaning in life, when artistic acclaim is what gives you identity and purpose, then it becomes destructive. There's nothing wrong with longing for a good job or to be in a good relationship or wanting a successful business. It's when those things become the center of our lives, when those things become the things that give us meaning, that we ultimately destroy ourselves. What we worship makes us who we are, and we have hearts that are made for the eternal. Worship of anything less will harm us. As St. Augustine famously put it, our hearts are restless until we find rest in God. You guys, worshiping idols means you'll become a slave to them. Make money or material comfort the central thing in life, and you'll become someone who never quite has enough and who will step on anyone in your way to keep yourself safe and happy. There's maybe never been a better example of this than the great John D. Rockefeller, who was the wealthiest man alive when he lived. He was asked by a reporter, how much would be enough? When would he accumulate enough? And he said, well, just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. He was a slave to that idol. And then even if you obtain the idol you're longing for, you'll start to realize that the satisfaction that you hoped it would bring will disappear. Worship a relationship and you'll quickly find that person lets you down or deserts you or passes out of your life. Just ask my wife, I should never be an idol in her life. Worship your career and you'll find that there's never enough work that can satisfy your soul. Who here was raised on the legend of comedy Jim Carrey? Yeah? All righty then, right? Come on, you know. We loved his movies, but what we didn't realize is that behind his entire life was a desperate journey for approval and affection from others. He felt that becoming a beloved comedian would get him the life he longed for, but even after he was a household name and multimillionaire, he realized he was just as empty as he was before when he was a nobody. His circumstances changed, but his heart hadn't. And in an interview later in his career, he put it this way. He said, I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so they can see it's not the answer. What Paul sees in Athens is what we see in our culture, friends. People chasing after idols in their life, longing to obtain gods that will only bring them to ruin. And he's reminding us that when we go into a marketplace, we need to be on the lookout for people's idols, what people worship. You can find them by asking good questions. Questions like, what are my neighbor's deepest anxieties? What are they most scared of? What do they hope for beyond everything else? You guys, I don't know if you see this, but I do. Our whole culture is dying, suffocating, languishing in lives that don't feel full and free and alive. We are coasting through comfort and materialism, and all the while our souls are anxious and bored and exhausted and worn out. That's the state of your neighbors. That's the state of many of you. How can we say we love them? How can we say we want the best for them if we can't spark honest conversations about the illusions and idols we're all buying into? How can we call ourselves followers of Jesus and keep coming to worship and sing songs and listen to sermons and take communion and then leave this place and not address the most pertinent, destructive parts of our people's and neighbors' lives? How can we call ourselves Christians and not talk about those things? We need to see what Paul sees and spark honest dialogue about it. And here's what's wild, friends. When you do this in people's lives, when you commit to just being curious about what's most important to them, it often leads them to realize things they didn't unless you brought it up. So often people live on cruise control, but then someone they trust asks them a curious question and they start to reflect and they're like, oh, I didn't even realize I was building my whole life on this pursuit. I should probably reevaluate that. I should think about that. Consider, in the trusted relationships you're in, asking a question like this: what is the thing that if it were to go away would mean life is no longer worth living? How do we answer that? How do our neighbors answer that? That will show us our idols. Those of you who are Christians in the room, you're only here because someone you trusted loved you enough to ask about your idols. Someone loved you enough to spark a spiritual conversation. Someone saw what Paul saw. So who are the people God has put in your life? Neighbors, coworkers, family members, who comes to mind? What might it look like to create some space to talk about this stuff with them? We need to see what Paul sees. And then finally, we need to do what Paul does. It starts with his emotional response to Athens. You may have caught it right at the beginning of the text. He says he was deeply distressed. That word, it's a deep, sustained compassion and grief in Paul's heart, which is important. It's not anger with which he speaks to the Athenians. It's not out of self-righteousness or pity for those poor people. It's out of a deeply felt mutual understanding of the pain of unfulfilled longing that his neighbors are feeling. Once we've seen the idolatry of our culture, we need to feel deeply distressed about the ways people are limited and in chains. We need to be people whose hearts break over the brokenness of our lives and our world and whose lives move towards our neighbors in love. We should be appalled at the idolatry of self or power or wealth or comfort in our culture. But we should also become people who move towards our neighbors in love because of it. So often we as Christians swing to one pendulum or the other. Sometimes we swing to outright condemnation. We're so distressed by what's going on in the world that we just rail against it and we fail to engage it at all. We war against culture. We speak down to it. We become cynical. And usually that happens because we've forgotten the idols out there are just as much idols in us. And then sometimes we swing the pendulum to the other side. We swing to outright affirmation of the culture. We become so compassionate to the world that we ignore or even sometimes celebrate idols that are actively leading to people's destruction just because we don't want to ruffle feathers. Out of a genuine and good desire not to hurt people, we hold back from embodying our faith or sparking spiritual conversations. Paul manages to avoid both extremes. He avoids condemnation, he avoids affirmation, and he just experiences distress that leads him to action. You guys, if we're not distressed by the world, then we're not awake to it. And if we're not in love with the world, we'll never change it. And then Paul, here, he shows us two main things to do. When we feel that distress, we need to learn to first respect the text. That is, do deep understanding work of our neighbors. And then build a bridge once we've respected the text. He respects the text by listening well. He actually shows that he's listened really well by communicating to these Greek people using their own poets and philosophers. The things he quotes, in him we live and move and have our being, and we are his offspring, those aren't the words of Paul. Those are Greek poets and philosophers. That's their artists. He's quoting their artists back to themselves, saying, you're on the way towards truth, and here it is. And not only does he listen well, he also uses language they will understand. When he gives his massive speech or sermon in front of the Areopagus, he never quotes the Hebrew Bible. Why? That's the whole text he had. Why doesn't he quote the Hebrew Bible? Because he wants to speak in a way these people understand. These aren't Jewish people. They didn't know about the Bible. Earlier, when he mentioned Jesus and the resurrection, they thought he was talking about two different gods. They were confused. Paul knows that if the message is going to matter at all to his hearer, he has to speak their language. He has to speak into their lives. And so he does. He respects his neighbor enough to communicate about the gospel using their own artistic preferences, using their poetic structures, using their spiritual themes. He actually trusts that God is already at work in the life of his neighbor before he shows up. If we're to make any meaningful headway in our spiritual conversations with others, we need to become good listeners, friends. Listen well to the things people say they believe. Don't just dismiss them. Pay attention to the sorts of songs that resonate with them, the experiences they seek, the moments that prompt spiritual longing in them. And then ask good questions. Questions like these. What are you most anxious about or fearful of? What do you hope for most in the world? If you were to sum up what you want your life to be about, what would you say? Tell me more about why you believe the things you believe. Those are good, curious questions. It's only when we listen well and speak their language that we embody the love of Christ. And then once we've done that, once we've respected the text, then we build a bridge. In Paul's sermon, he mentions that in all of his listening and exploring and learning from the Athenians' worship, he notices an empty altar, the unknown God altar. Isn't that interesting? These people who had hundreds of things to worship, hundreds of things to devote their lives to, still knew deep down they were missing something. They knew they hadn't yet found what they were looking for. Their hearts were still restless. That sounds a lot like our culture. And so Paul says, guys, you know that altar to the tomb, to the unknown God? That thing you're groping for and reaching for and can never quite find? I know it because I found it. Or better yet, it found me. It's not even an it, it's a him. His name's Jesus. He is the truth you've been searching for. He is the satisfaction that you've been longing for. He is balm for a wounded soul. He is water for a thirsty heart. He is bread for a starving life. He knows you're burnt out on worshiping the wrong things. He's come to judge, and he's come so that all might know him and experience him. Know his deep satisfaction in life and peace. You know that all other worship will only lead you to death, but there is worship that leads to life. There is one single priority that will bring resurrection. It's the worship of Jesus. Do you see how Paul's building a bridge? This isn't a predetermined script. It's not a tract or a brochure. He sees exactly what his neighbor's going through, exactly what his neighbors deeply long for, and the ways those things have failed him. He listens really well, and then he builds a bridge to their hearts. You guys, becoming a link in the chain means building a bridge to the deepest longings in the hearts of our neighbors. It means entrusted and mutually curious relationship becoming like Jesus, kingdom people in all of our cultural spaces. It means seeing the idols of our culture that grab a hold of people and often grab a hold of us. It means listening well to them, and it means speaking to their hearts, showing them where Jesus meets them where they are. Because when we do, what we will find is what the Athenians found here. Amidst all our grasping and groping for truth and life, we'll find Christ. We'll find the unknown God, the unknown truth of all reality made known to us in the person of Jesus. That is good news in a world in desperate need of it, friends. Let's pray together.